Welcome to episode 51 of the Electric Bison. This has been kind of an interesting experience. I've enjoyed it a lot, trying to learn from the ground up. So if you go back through the first 50 episodes of this podcast, you're going to find some really rinky-dink stuff. But the whole point was to try to learn by doing, and I've learned a lot. The first 20 or so episodes was about the Battle of the Bulge. And I wanted people who are from Montana particularly to really value what their parents and grandparents did to protect our democracy in the biggest assault by Hitler on U.S. forces during World War II. You know, 1 million men were engaged in deadly combat. And I think even people who were in that battle, and so far we know 274 in Montana who were in it, they didn't even know the full extent of that battle. It was vicious. It went on for almost a month. So I put that in there so people could get grounded in what it's taken to protect our country and our democracy against a fascist, which I think Trump is a fascist. And if you disagree with me and I've put you off, I hope that you'll at least listen to what happened when Hitler attacked our people and thought we would lose and cut and run because he considered us a bunch of mongrels. That's what he said. But we didn't cut and run. But a lot of people died. And it may come to that, who knows, with this next couple of years now for this generation. But then in addition to that, there's some episodes about the 17 and a half years that I've had, my wife and I have had a decentralized electricity generation. Solar panels, we put them in a long time ago after the attacks of 9/11, which I was involved in, so that we wouldn't be so dependent on Middle Eastern energy. And from 17 and a half years, we've learned a lot, and I'm just real candid about how I let it slip, how our usage of electricity has gone up from 5 kilowatt hours a month up to about 10, and what we need to do to get it back down, or at least make sure we have our essential electricity, which isn't anywhere near 10. It's probably more like 4 kilowatt hours. Right now we're doing about 2 or 3, and I wanted to show you how that works and our discretionary load and how to figure out what you really need, and then encourage you to find ways to produce your own electricity, because we may not have the centralized system that we have now in the future. And then the next bunch of episodes is about the war with Mexico. If you remember, you hardly talked about it in high school, but what that was about was by a president like President Trump. His name was Polk, James Polk. He was a slave owner, and he insisted on forcing Mexico into a war so that he could get their lands up where New Mexico and Arizona, Nevada, California, Utah are now, after we had admitted Texas, which was a slave state, to the Union. His idea was to have more slave states. And it's about the people who were forced into that to fight, and some of the issues that they had to deal with, which I think our soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, Coast Guardsmen are going to have to deal with that if President Trump decides he wants to go down and do something with Mexico or with Canada or with Greenland. Who knows? But I thought it would be a useful piece of history for people to know what's come before. So now that takes us to, and that'll be the, when we come to this episode, it's me being an old guy. I'm familiar with Earth Day, and I was in New York City when the first Earth Day happened 54 years ago. And it left a big impression with me, but I don't know if people even know about it now. But I thought what we would do is with Doug Balmain, who's been just gracious as can be to join me for this very first kind of a podcast that's supposed to be what a podcast looks like. It's not like homemade like the first 50. That Doug's here with me, and then video Jeannie Warden, who's the camera lady. She's first class. She's a really reliable person. She's consented to film us, and I really appreciate that. But I think the key thing for one of these podcasts when you're with someone else, and I've never been with someone else before on a podcast, is to not script it. And so this is kind of like a couple of guys talking in a coffee shop. here in Helena, and we usually visit when we're down at the Merc, but we haven't talked about this. I've got 3 prompts about 20 minutes apart that'll help refocus our discussion if we get carried away. And that's how I'll proceed, is I'll just read what the prompt is for now, and we'll talk. I'll talk probably more at first, and then we'll move into the other 2. The prompt that I want to talk about first, and that Doug can get into this anytime, I'm not sure how to introduce him. He's a refugee from south of the border, right? Wyoming. So, but I think he's pretty sharp, and I like Doug. But I'd like to talk about Earth Day back in 1970, the very first, and now in 2025. I can't believe that time's gone by as fast as it has. But in 1970, I've been thinking about those old guys who were in the Grand Army of the Republic that used to stand around by their cannons and talk about the old, Gettysburg and Antietam and all that. And I'm thinking, I'm kind of like those guys now. I don't have a beard. But Doug and his generation came along a lot later, so I try not to bore you, but a couple of things that happened back around Earth Day I think are important to talk about. One is Armstrong walked on the moon the summer before, 1969. I was up on a lookout in the Selway Wilderness area by myself at that time, and I got my binoculars out trying to see the first man walking on the moon. I couldn't see him, but I didn't have a television. Probably one of the few people that didn't see it happen. And then came from that with my wife, who had come back from her father's funeral. We went down to New York City to start my second year at Columbia University. And as we were going into New York City with our packs on our back, just like Montanans and Wyomingites, people from the West still do, I'm sure, Woodstock was going on. I didn't know any of the bands. I certainly know about it since then, but it was a thing going on kind of in the background noise. And President Trump, who's the same age I am, we're the same age within a month. I think he's a month older. He was out, handling his father's properties in the periphery of New York City, and I was in the middle of it. And we made our way up to 116th and Broadway and stayed in a hotel that first night watching our pennies. But that year was full of a lot of important things. There's a lot of bombings going on in Vietnam, things that were really tragic looking back on it. And so one of the things I noticed while I was going through my second year at the Columbia Graduate School of International Affairs was out of nowhere, with all this going on around us, these books started showing up in the bookstore. I remember thinking, well, it's like, did everybody read from the same sheet of music? All these books on something called the environment, which was not something we talked about. We never talked about that. And I mean, I come from a family that threw its grocery store bags of beer cans out on the highway just like that. And I think about it now and I go, I can't believe we did that, but we did. And I come from a Butte family, which, we're probably the original rape and scrape artists. So what happened was these books started showing up in some of the bookstores I would frequent talking about the environment or Silent Spring or whatever it was at the time. And then suddenly, it was really strange. I'm in New York City. I love that town. But anyhow, it was, a lot of demonstrations going on. The invasion of Cambodia hadn't quite happened yet. And suddenly I hear about this Earth Day, and it's in the middle of the week, and my wife was teaching at PS12 in Yonkers. So I had time. I went on down to 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. Trump Tower's on Fifth Avenue. It's farther up, farther north. And I sat in one of my favorite places in the whole world is on the steps of the New York Public Library. And I watched all these people going by me on Fifth Avenue that was closed for, I think, 48 blocks from 59th South to about 12th Street, and then across 12th Street. And there was all this street theater going on and people talking to each other and all these beautiful women coming out of their offices. I was 20-something. I loved it. It was like such a break in such a horrendous, stressful time. And it was really, I thought, this is really wonderful. Whoever thought this up, this is a great idea. So I've always kind of wondered, what was going to be the next thing happening with Earth Day. But that's when it got inaugurated, right in the middle of all this other stuff. And then when I, just a few days later, the United States invaded Cambodia. And then my oldest daughter, Shanda, she was born up at Women's Hospital up by Columbia on Amsterdam Avenue. And it was, long labor, took a long time. Had a woman helping my wife out from Barbados who sang. I swore she was black, but I swore she was Irish because she was singing all the same songs my mother used to sing to me. And all these big experiences were going on around Earth Day. And then there was a huge march. I mean, there was a lot of marches, teach-ins, marches, but my wife and I got in that, and I think that's probably what caused her to have the baby, but it was long. I remember it was 17 miles long. It's huge, against the war, the invasion of Cambodia, and or reacting to it. And and then the baby came right quick, and so we got through that, and I paid the doctor, Dr. Nathanson, who is the lead abortion doctor in New York City. He was a big name in those days. He delivered. The nurses said he was the best OBG. So how else would I know? Paid him his $300 so I could get her out of Hawk. That was my last $300 except for a train fare to go to Washington, D.C. to take my Foreign Service oral exams. And that was why I was going to college. I had seen Mike Mansfield, and I was just a dumbass kid from Montana, but I wanted to be a diplomat. And but with that thing happening in Cambodia, I went down to Washington, D.C. from Penn Station, and I remember it was about the 4th of May. My daughter was born on the 3rd. Got on the train in Penn Station, opened up the New York Times, and there was the girl, must have been the 5th, kneeling next to a young guy that had been shot by the National Guard there in Kent State in Ohio. And so that was the background. So when I go down to Washington, D.C., I get off the train at Union Station, and I'd been in New York, except for on in the wilderness on the lookout. And honest to God, I felt when I got into Washington, D.C., I felt like Mary Poppins should live there. It was like a fantasy land compared to New York City. New York City was really intense in those days. And that's when Earth Day happened, right in the middle of that. And so, I went off to the infantry school. I only had so much time, a deferment. I had to go and be in the military for a couple of years. But when I came back, suddenly I couldn't get a job. People weren't automatically heroes for being in the Army. I just can't get over how people can go from one way to the other. But you need to know who you are, because if you go by popular sentiment, you're going to get screwed up big time. But I came home, and you couldn't get a job if you were a veteran. And all my classmates from Columbia were working for Chase Manhattan and Esso International and Shell and God knows what else, making good money. Here I was in Montana, thinning trees, trying to get a job, and I couldn't get one. Had a lot of turndowns. And so that's why I ran for public office. I was unemployed. And they were in the small town of Hamilton. When I went home, the people thought he's either on. They couldn't figure it out. They were always trying to figure out what's he doing for a living. Well, either I was independently wealthy, or I was on welfare. One or the other, depending on it was really quite an education. But I got elected, and so that's how I got into public office. And I think, that was 2 years after Earth Day. Earth Day receded. But what I found myself involved in was the legislature, both as a legislator and a majority leader and a speaker. And I remember, relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, Bob Corrett, who was one of the Corrett brothers that ran the Montana Power Company, which was a predecessor for Northwest Energy. I remember him telling me, he'd bring in all the little old ladies in black dresses with pearl necklaces to protest, doing something bad for Montana Power would hurt their stock prices. It was really an education. But anyhow, One day, Corette, who's he was a tough old bird, he says to me, he says, you know, no matter how much electricity we make, people are going to use the same amount. You know, in the economic terms, the price elasticity of demand was basically, it wasn't any. In other words, if you raise the price like salt, you'd still use what you needed, and that was it. And I think it's important to remember that those kind of decisions that led to these big coal plants that we have now, that we're trying to deal with, probably were honest mistakes, really. And my job later, when I became Public Service Commissioner, in another iteration of my public life, I had to decide whether or not portions of Colstrip were used and useful. Because if they were not used and useful, we wouldn't put them in the rate base. And that would leave Montana Power with some of its coal plants not covered. And I did that. I did that, I think once. I'd have to go back and look at all the decisions, but I was a problem for Montana Power. And so were some of the other commissioners I worked with, and staff. But it was honest. We tried to mimic what the market said the people that we represented would need used, as if they were in a free market. That was kind of what our job was. And so that caused me to go back to New York City because, like I say, I was kind of a problem. Maybe some of the other commissioners will think I was a lot of a problem, but I got asked to go back, and I went back, and they paid my way. It was a utility stock or utility finance newsletter, Argo something. But anyhow, they asked me to come back, and they put me up at the New York Athletic Club. This would be in the 80s, so this is 10 years after, more than 10 years after the first Earth Day. And New York Athletic Club is really nice. And then I had to meet them for a breakfast meeting to get kind of let them ask me questions in the Windows on the World restaurant up at the top of the World Trade Center. And I think about that because, I mean, I was right there. I was in the corner looking out on Wall Street. Here I'm this guy from Montana, and then later on when I was in the Pentagon, we got attacked on 9/11. And I got home and watched the people jumping out of those top floors. I kind of knew what they were going through, and they didn't have a parachute. But anyhow, so I ended up down over the stock exchange, the floor of the stock exchange. And there's a boardroom up there. You see the stuff on the stock, but up above, I mean, straight above, there's this long boardroom, and I was in it, and there's this long skinny table with all these analysts, like 50? I mean, a lot. And they're writing down every word I had to say because Colstrip was a lot of money for somebody. And so I remember telling them what I thought, you know. So, so then by the time I got home to Montana, the word was out that Driscoll was, he was going to screw up Wall Street big time, or at least that portion of Wall Street. They hammered me pretty good for being not caring about whether a company goes bankrupt or not, but that wasn't my job. My job was to try to mimic the market, and I thought we did a pretty good job in those days. So that brings us up to now, 2025, and I checked because I'm interested in Earth Day, and the theme for Earth Day in 2025, 54 years later, is our planet, our power. How are we going to power our lives and take care of the planet at the same time? And that gosh darn Colstrip, we had Colstrip 1, 2, and then 3 and 4 later. I think it was 3 and 4 I was back talking to the people on Wall Street about. But they're still hanging around. And it's like, God, this is going to be in my whole life. My whole life is going to have Colstrip in it and the power and the transmission lines, but it looks real different to me now, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But I guess I got one question for you, Doug. I'm not going to grill you, but have you ever even heard of Earth Day?
Oh yeah.
Have you?
Yeah. Earth Day. it took me a while to form any sort of relationship to it. I remember, I don't know how old I was, but I was young when I learned about Earth Day, and I'd stumbled into them. I think that perhaps they part of the community had integrated it into maybe a farmer's market or some sort of festival. And unbeknownst to me, I arrived at this place and there was a celebration. I have to go way back in time to recall this, but what strikes me as most interesting from this sort of fragmented, imperfect memory I have of coming across this first Earth Day was that I didn't understand it at all, which in hindsight is alarming. It should be very intuitive. Anything that lives on Earth, makes life on Earth, derives life from Earth, ought to have a pretty innate and intuitive understanding as to why we might be taking a day to celebrate and appreciate the Earth. And it is a bit surreal to look back and remember, like, oh, those people were dressed kind of funny. That music was different. Yeah, and that really stands out. And it's a lesson. It's sort of a parable, because here's this thing that's so immediate, so obvious, so innate, and yet somehow I was missing it. I didn't understand the correlation. And I have a number of things like that in my life, a lot of them, but whenever I become aware of that dissonance within myself, I always catalog that, I bookmark it, and I use it as a tool to remind myself to pay attention, because you might be taking things for granted, and in doing so, missing fundamental elements of a picture that should be quite apparent.
Well, have you ever had any big environmental fights that you got yourself involved in, where there was a lot of money on the table, or strong feelings? Or are you just starting in that part of your life?
Oh, I've been in a few already, and continue. I'm trying to sort out how to package it, because they're ongoing. I feel like all of these issues right now, especially with the dissonance between human life and our demands versus planetary life and its demands, which again should be the same, but they haven't been. And I know there's more focus now than there ever has been on trying to make those two a cooperative relationship. But some of it is, one of the most recent issues I was most directly involved in is up in the Yak, very far northwestern corner of Montana. And there's a number of organizations there, including Helena-based Alliance for the Wild Rockies, who have had their eyes on a first-generation Trump logging plan up there in some tracts that have never been logged, have never seen a saw, and they're in a really unusual environment, especially for the western states, because they are situated still on the west slope of the Rockies, and in such a way that they get sort of this residual temperate climate from the Pacific storm systems. So you see a species diversity and a size and scale and overall age of forest there that we've all but eradicated. It's very rare, very little of it left. And during Trump's first term, a plan named Black Ram to harvest those old trees in that old forest got an executive order signed, And since then, it's been under litigation. And so far, it just came out of another appeals court, and currently logging is halted, which is, it's a good win. It's a minor win, and it can always come back if they do an EIS and amend the timber contract. The issue could be reopened, certainly. But the human aspect of it is difficult, because being up in the Yak and to some extent learning about the people who live there, how they make a living, how they see the world, what their reality is, they're none too happy for the most part with the environmentalist group. They want to see jobs, they want to see the mills open,
Yeah. They
they want to see logging trucks on the road. They don't want restriction. They don't want to be told what they can and can't do. And I never set out to get in a fight about those things. I don't think that's productive. But still, there's a lot of emotion, a lot of tempers around trying to basically ask people to broaden perspectives, broaden how they understand their own lives and their own homes and their own relationship to what's around them. And I'm certainly not a prophet. I don't have the answers, but I think there's certain instances when we have intuitive, available responses. You know, if we amended that timber sale to not include any primary old growth, that's not going to hurt the timber companies. It's not going to put anybody out of business. But it's more this idea that we can't get past these beliefs that if we want it, if we fill out the forms, if we can cut it and sell it, we ought to be able to.
Yeah. So it's kind of it's the rarity of what's remaining up there that you're really concerned about. At a time when growing timber is seen as mass timber in buildings and growing timber in forests is seen as part of the answer to climate change. We're trying to preserve some of this old growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's like running against two currents, I think. Because I'm familiar with the logging families, how they feel because I was in the Bitterroot. Yeah, but I think your sense of it's a good one. I really do. It's because they won't make any more of it, you know.
Yeah, it's when it's gone, it's gone. In forestry now, I mean, it's always been under the Department of Agriculture, but it's truly agriculture now. I mean, we're quite literally farming trees. And I think, especially looking into the immediate future, one of our most dire needs is diversity, not only ecological diversity, but to another point that I'm sure we'll get to in this talk, is energy diversity. We can't, I think, maintain that singularly focused mindset anymore about this is where power comes from, this is where lumber comes from. You know, we need to broaden our perspectives and be willing to be more adaptable and diverse than the old mindset that got us here. I mean, we're here because of that old mindset.
Yeah, when I went back and got another degree at Harvard, and the guy living in the old house next to me was a physicist from China, Dr. Dandy Wu, and he and I got to be good friends. And when I told him what I did in Montana, he says, "Oh, you're a Gompu." And I said, "What's a Gompu?" And he goes, "That's a cadre member." In other words, I was about as good as the Communist Party as far as he was concerned, which he did not like. But anyhow, he goes. He said, in China we have a rule about leaders. Every leader builds 3 fires, he said. And, you know, they want to cut down all the corn, and then they want to cut down all the trees. And we kind of do that ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it seems like, I wonder if we do that. We absolutely do it. In the Bitterroot, when the clear cuts were happening back in the 60s, it was really bad. But now, But I like your thoughts. I don't know how that, it kind of comes down to the people in that community, doesn't it? Because there's going to be people that like to go out there and know what's out there and know what the values are, and they're the ones who are going to have to ask for that amended sale.
That's the complicated aspect. And it's hard, and these conversations happen, I think, in every community on some level, but there's a dissonance between what people believe they are gaining versus what they actually gain. And coal mining is a great exemplifier of that situation. You have the miners who want to mine, but they usually aren't the ones that are actually going to reap the benefits. They're not the people on Wall Street concerned about the portfolio of Colstrip. They're just going to get used up as labor, usually as cheaply as possible, and with as little responsibility as possible historically. And the yak is another microcosm, and the other dissonance in the belief is why are people in the yak? Well, most people are in the yak because they want it to be wild. They want it to be beautiful. They want it to be forested. They want it to be sort of, I think I'll just reiterate wild. I think it really is this longing for wildness. However, the conservative mindset traditionally sort of skews what that means, where instead of wild, they sort of assert this dominance over the land, dominance over their ability to do whatever they want with the land.
Yeah.
And so where that runs into itself, especially with an issue like the Black Ram Cut, is yes, they are innately there because of the wildness, but what they're really rebelling against most strongly is somebody telling them what can or can't happen there. But if somebody says it can happen, they're not going to get any money from it, and they're going to lose their wildness. So, mostly unsuccessfully, although I have managed to have productive two-way conversations based more on that. It's how do we believe that we ourselves are relating to this issue, and are those beliefs actually in line with what we want, or are they self-defeating?
Yeah. You reminded me, one of the other things that happened in those early years for me in the legislature is I got involved with the coal tax. I mean, we did a lot of great stuff in those early years, and strip mine reclamation, clean air, clean water, and the states benefited from that. We did what we knew whatever we thought we knew, we put it into effect. But one of them was the coal tax, and I've been thinking about this since we decided to have this podcast. That coal tax, my old friend Miles Romney's the one that was pushing it, and then Tom Town, Billings, and some others. But anyhow, the way it ended up, myself and Tom Tow and Chet Blaylock were the ones that made the argument for the coal tax trust fund on the ballot, and the people of Montana approved it. And the truth of the matter is, that was, I think, 77, 76, somewhere in there. But anyhow, we could never have done that with metal mines. We did it with fossil fuel, with fossil fuels. And then it had to be really trimmed up so it didn't violate the Interstate Commerce Commission. Then Greeley's office, the Attorney General, had to defend it in the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a major effort, but we got it. But if we had tried to do it with metal mines, which is Butte, where my family's from, both sides of the town, we never would have been able to do it. In fact, we talked about it. You couldn't, because Butte was like the yak you're talking about now. Butte was so committed, so reliant on mining, copper and zinc and molybdenum and so forth. And I remember knowing that. And then what happened, I think, is in those years, right around the time of the coal tax, Butte shut down. Underground mining in Butte ended when the Chileans nationalized the copper properties in South America. That was in '73. And then for 10 years it kind of lingered on with the pit, but then it ended for sure. And I turned the pumps off and the water started flooding the hill. And it's really interesting. Up to that time, which is 50, 54, 55 years, the Anaconda Company ran this friggin' state. They did. I mean, it was interesting to hear about Norman McLean the other day, the writer of A River Runs Through It and Young Men and Fire, how he left Montana because he couldn't stand to be unmanned by the Anaconda Company. He felt that people had to bend over, and kiss their butts, which they did. And all the newspapers and so forth, and because it was so important economically. It was a bigger town than Troy or one of those other towns up there. But what's interesting to me as I think about this now is that coal tax was like a pivot point, and the shutdown of the mines. And suddenly Butte no longer ran the state. I mean, you couldn't, you still can't, you'd have a tough time running for office in Butte, as I have 3 times for the Public Service Commission. Once you get through the primary as a Democrat, you're golden. You don't even have to work at it. You can get elected in the general. I just had that experience in the eastern part of the state. For the other side, if you run as a Republican and you get through the primary, you don't have, don't lose any sleep. You're going to get elected. And the numbers are out there. But that's because what happened with Butte, that had been with Butte, switched over to the fossil fuel company. And so we had a little time in there to do something with strip mine reclamation and the coal tax, and then of course all the things that drive people who are skilled workers, who are worried about their jobs and their families, their towns. That kicked in, and so you're dealing with pretty strong stuff out in eastern Montana, like the way Butte used to be. And so now instead of going through Butte and seeing all the lights on the head frames, you go through Billings and see all the lights on the refinery towers. I get it. I get it. And I think that, but I think, seriously, for what it's worth, we're coming to a point now where that's going to end. And I think it has to do with the Colstrip plant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's interesting to look back over it. It's like you see it over here, and you see it over here in the eastern part of the state. I mean, Northwest Energy, if they said frog, the legislature and the Public Service Commission would say, how high? I mean, that's just the way it works. That's the way the Anaconda Company used to be. That's why we have elected Public Service Commissioners. We tried to break that, but you couldn't. It was real until the economic importance went away. I understand that. Anyhow, I'm going to move on to the next thing. I see if we haven't talked about it already. The second thing I wanted to talk about is bison, buffalo, but they're really bison, not bovine, but bison, and electricity. Now, I named this podcast, the electric bison. And from my experience, electricity now has become what sustains our culture and our society. I mean, all the stuff in this room, the way we're going to communicate to people, it's all electricity-based technology. And the bison used to be, and then the Native American societies almost collapsed. They didn't completely. But really, electricity has become our intermediate energy form. Very expensive to make it, but once you have it, you can do all kinds of things with it, no matter how you made it. I mean, if you make it from the biggest polluting, god-awful plant there ever was, and it's good electricity, it's good to go, and which is kind of what's happening with Colstrip now. But so this idea of a intermediate energy form that our present-day society depends on, it fascinates me. And I'm just thinking, I'm wondering what you think about that. What you think about the importance of electricity.
Well, it can't be understated. I think the underlying philosophy that you chose for naming the podcast is spot on. We can't survive without it. Our society is entirely electricity dependent. Where that's going to take us, or how we need to evolve, or how we're going to finalize the energy transition, are incredibly complex, and I wish I felt I had more footing as to what we need to do versus what we are doing now. But it's not black and white. All the research that I do independently suggests that we're doing a lot of things right now. We're making a lot of really substantial inroads and progress and diversifying. And on the other end of the spectrum, we're doing things that are counterintuitive, that are accelerating the problems we've already created. And where is the balance? Where is the middle ground? To go back a couple questions, you asked about environmental issues that I've been involved in, and one of them is in the Shirley Basin of Wyoming, and the issue there is an issue of a turbine installation, wind turbines. And I am a proponent of wind energy. I'm a proponent of alternative energy development. However, I showed up on the scene and continue to be on the scene in the Shirley Basin against wind in that area. It's a small area. I think the project site is less than 100,000 acres. It's on a high elevation sagebrush steppe. The ecosystem there is relatively intact. I mean, it's been grazed hard for years. In the past, there's been uranium mining in the area. But you can go out on this intact sagebrush steppe ecosystem and still see the flora and fauna that evolved to be there. It is intact. It harbors species diversity, ancient soils, and a place that I think, instead of looking at just real estate, places where we can impose our technologies, I think we need to start looking at the earth as an active technology as well. I mean, I hate to use the word technology in conjunction with earth, because I think technology is ours and it's less genuine perhaps than how the earth evolved to create life and sustain life. And I think the Shirley Basin is a case where we can look at the energy transition and see that, yes, we need to continue forward progress with this energy transition, but at the same time, we have to pay attention to the earth itself and the requirements for life, and recognize where biodiversity in an intact ecosystem on this 100,000 acre tract is serving us. It is doing a job. It's not passive. It's not wasted land. It's not land that's undeveloped. It's a working, breathing, living ecosystem, and those are going to be just as important as any of our technological advancements going forward.
Yeah, I just finished reading that book by the New York Times real estate and energy reporter Amy Gamerman. It's called The Crazies. It's a pretty good book. And what's interesting about that, it's about a wind farm. When I ended up at the Public Service Commission, I was there 3 terms, and then my fund meter pegged out, and I decided not to run again. But about the middle of my second term, I was over in Livingston trying to tell people we need to have wind farms. There wasn't even any windmills yet. Now there's over 4,000 in Montana alone. 22 big wind farms. I can't believe it. So it wasn't because of me, but it picked up. But that thing about the Crazies, they was about an 80 megawatt wind farm, utility scale wind farm, going to go in west of Big Timber, in front of the Crazy Mountains, and it's about what happened there, and it's really interesting, and it's a good book because she honestly and accurately describes, I think, all the players, and they're really interesting people. The rancher that the two ranchers that needed to, make their ranch work, get some money from the wind, and they had all the legal horsepower, or a lot of it, that they needed. And then the wealthy people that have moved into Montana, I mean, they're seriously wealthy. They're richer than you or me.
No kidding.
It's unbelievable. And they all, how they each came by their money. Some really interesting people, and I understand where they're coming from. And some of them got their money raping and scraping someplace else, some in Las Vegas doing various things. It's such an interesting book, and how they came to loggerheads with the ranchers that wanted to have the wind farms, and they won. I shouldn't give it away, but it's such an interesting thing, and there's so much valuable information in that book, like how one would put together his big ranch. He collected up ranch. He had so much money, he doesn't even know what to do with it. But anyhow, he buys ranches. And he bought a ranch over there on the southwest side of the Crazies. And I think he bought out 7 ranchers. Well, I'm thinking, ever since I can remember, we've been worried about ranchers going out of business and farmers and getting older, the average age. And it's like an infinite energy machine. It's like the farmers are always getting older. Well, as a matter of fact, they're disappearing. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about people that own the land that don't want the energy. You don't, would agree with you maybe in the specifics of that situation, but they have their own reasons, mm-hmm. And it's so complicated. It's so complicated, and and then the peak, which is sacred to the Crow people, is owned by Dave Lucian from Riverside Investment Group, which owns Talon, which owns 10% of the Colstrip plants, the remaining ones, and now he's moved into carbon. They've moved into big investments in a carbon-free industries, which is great. And he's part owner of Colstrip, and it gives me a headache sometimes, mm-hmm. thinking about all these variables, mm-hmm. how they're all moving around at the same time. And then I really think it's important to stay abreast of who's actually here in Montana. Like, you came up from Wyoming. I'm really glad to see you. We need your help. I never thought I'd say that about a Wyoming person. Yeah. But anyhow, it's like, I mean, in my day, Wyoming was mining all the coal they could get their hands mm-hmm. on, and couldn't figure out where we were coming from with the coal tax trust. But I really like where you're coming from on some of this stuff, and there must be others that feel the same way. But anyhow, the last thing I thought we should talk about is how do we strengthen the bison and the electricity thing and still make this place livable. And when I read about the wealthy people down around Big Timber, and how they're buying out these ranches who probably need to get out. That's their only retirement. They've been working hard all their lives. You can't fault them. I'm looking at that and I'm going, these guys really might want to have buffalo on their land instead of cows. I don't think you go up to Winnett and places up there and you see the sign saying, save a cowboy. Mm-hmm. But really, they're not cowboys. They might be Yellowstone cowboys, mm-hmm. but they're not really. And they love the lifestyle, but they might be part of the answer for this whole bison thing. And I don't know for sure, but especially if the ranchers are going out of business, who knows what's going to happen with these tariffs that we just saw come in. Mm-hmm. That's got to change that business a lot. And everybody's figuring simultaneously. But anyhow, I'm interested in what you found out about bison. Now, where's that at now?
Another complicated issue. It's a fascinating issue, and as always, we have to kind of roll back the clock to get started. And what I mean by that is when we use the word bison or buffalo, we're passively or actively, I think in most cases passively, calling up this memory of something that nobody alive today ever lived through, which was this fenceless expanse, the North American Serengeti. You have huge migratory herds. All of the animals in the ecosystem exist. That includes other grazers and ungulates, and also the full spectrum of predators. Our watersheds are completely different. There's no dams, there's no roads, there's no railroad tracks, there's no barbed wire. And I think to this day, when we say bison and think of bison, there's still sort of this calling back to wildness again, a more wild animal, an animal that evolved on the landscape. And that, unfortunately, right now, I think is being usurped by animal agriculture, kind of playing on an ideal for the sake of strengthening animal agriculture sentiments in some cases. And I want to be careful here because I have a lot of allies on both sides of the fence. I have a lot of rancher friends who are younger, who are in the regenerative agriculture movement, who are taking it extremely seriously and taking their responsibility to growing food and serving the earth at the same time extremely seriously. But this trade-off from bison, or from beef to bison, in some cases is simply following the money. I mean, you named in your last segment a contact who is simultaneously investing in green energy while owning a large stake in Colstrip.
Right. And
I don't know what his mindset is. I don't know what he does or doesn't believe, but I would suggest that he's probably just following the money, and maybe doesn't really care about the energy itself, just cares about what's going to pay and what isn't.
Yeah, there's a lot to that.
Yeah, and my caution here with the movement towards bison agriculture is that we remember that this is still an agricultural system, and if we simply replace the animal but keep the same methods, it's not going to help us. We're just going to continue this cycle that we're already in. However, there's a way, I think, with cows as well, cows or bison, it depends on the practice. Right now, the Cuban livestock is practicing regenerative agriculture, getting better all the time, using intensive grazing, using electric fencing that's mobile, modular electric fencing, rather than traditional, just static pasturing, to mimic this flow and interaction that a large migratory herd would have on the land versus this sort of static placement. And with bison coming back into our lives, both reinstating, I mean, if you look at the American Prairie Reserve, they are trying to reinstate a mini version of the North American Serengeti, and they do want it to be a wild place. And if we're talking about agriculture and reinstating bison as a meat product, we still need to be very, very careful that we are doing everything we can within an unnatural system to allow those bison to interact with the natural land in a way that sort of represents how they would have originally, even if it's imperfect.
Yeah.
What I would hate to see, what I would just hate to see is for them to simply become a commodity that's marketed in a certain way that gets the consumer to believe they're buying a better product, when in actuality, all the same destructive processes are in place behind the scenes. I would hate to see that.
That's great. I mean, that's a great caution, because I was kind of inclined that way when I saw that bison are so much easier on the atmosphere, climate change wise. They're pricier. The food, they taste better, at least with the normal cows. But I think that's a good caution. Jack Wagner, who's a Blackfeet Indian that we have coffee with, he told me to be sure and watch Lily Gladstone and her friends' production of Bring Them Home about the bison up on the Blackfeet Reservation. I've been noticing that when I was campaigning this last year summer and fall through eastern Montana. I saw bison herds where I had never seen them before. I knew they were down on the northern Cheyenne, and I, of course, knew that the Salish Kootenai had picked up the National Bison Refuge. But, man, you'll see them, in central Montana, you see them in place. Like, I was taking a guy to the hospital down in Billings in that god-awful snowstorm we had for a couple weeks. And the last thing I expected to see was a herd of bison turned into the storm, getting snowed on, not bothering them a bit. And I thought, I've never seen them there before. So there's some evidence that some of it's coming back. But that film, Bring Them Home, which it's only 27 minutes long on PBS, they were having to move the bison, probably 250, maybe 300, from one pasture to another, and get them through gates and stuff because they had fences in the way. Boy, and if the Blackfeet still have to do that, you and I don't have property that big. One of the things I always liked about the Blackfeet is they like to steal other people's horses, right? And then what they would do is sit there and just watch them be horses. Now, I don't know if that's something our American culture can do, just watch buffalo be buffalo. So I don't know. You're for it, but I don't know if that's ever going to work.
Yeah, well, it is happening, and it's contested. You already mentioned the signs around the state say the cowboy, and I think they're largely in protest. At least some of them are to the American Prairie Reserve, and that is their mission. They want a large tract of unfenced land to let bison and everything else that evolved with them in that ecosystem just be what they are, just exist. And unfortunately, that's met with great opposition, not only locally, but I think our greater power structures, our absentee power structures from the East Coast in particular, do not want that mindset, the Earth Day mindset, to go too far.
Yeah.
Because what does it do? It brings up checks and balances. It shuts projects down, in some cases, industrial projects. Trump certainly would not appreciate that mindset, because then people won't go along with him just signing papers and going out to do whatever he thinks they ought to go do, because people are becoming more consciously aware of their own relationship to the earth and the repercussions of what we're asking for. And I think that more than anything, more than even the local resistance to things like rewilding, I think corporate and political resistance is what drives that first and foremost, because they don't want us to be too conscientious, I don't believe.
Well, that thing about being conscious of our relationship to the earth, that's an ongoing project for each of us. I mean, it truly is. 78 years for me, and I'm still working on it, but you're on the right track. And that means you don't need as much electricity, I can tell you that right now. We have it because I get lazy once in a while. I want a snowblower that's electric, or a lawnmower that's electric, or whatever. I got so much of those, but they're all discretionary. And I really feel like that part of it is knowing what our relationship, good for us, relationship is to the earth. And each of us is less of a problem, but boy, there's a lot of people out there.
Yeah. And I would like to see it shift from, this is kind of wishful thinking, but I would like to see the mindset shift from simply abstaining from not wishing to expend the energy, so we reel ourselves in, we abstain, we consume less, almost in a self-limiting fashion, and instead realize that there are ways to live better, to have a more full conscious reality and conscious relationships that by virtue of serving those relationships, become less expensive, become more conscientious, because that's what we want for ourselves, not because we're just pulling back on the reins because we don't have enough energy to go around, So we're right up at the limit all the time, And I think there's a way, again, to change our relationship to that without also curbing progress. I mean, I think everything that's happening now, even though so much of it feels unnatural and seems unnatural, I don't have any place deciding what is and isn't natural. If I take all my own biases out of my mind, or try to, I see that we are a species that evolved and is evolving and is building tools, is building mechanisms to ostensibly live better, to become more like ourselves. And that's hard to admit, because there's a lot of human progress that I see that I don't like. It doesn't look good, it doesn't feel good, it seems counterintuitive, it seems unnatural. But I think there's a way, as with all the conversations we've had today, to find a middle where we can still responsibly progress, still develop ways to, maybe someday we will have abundant energy. There's a lot of technologies on the horizon that could deliver that. But we still have to achieve it and utilize it in a mature way, in a way that maintains our relationship to where we're from, and not just, I want more because I want more, and I want more now.
That's really good, Doug. What you got me thinking back on is, well, first of all, up at the School of Mines at Montana University of Technology now in Butte, they have a Center for Advanced Mineral Processing, and I was talking to her, and she said, "Don't talk about, it's not refinery workers or oil field workers or coal mine workers. They're energy workers, and all the skills you need in all those things. In a refinery, you know how to make hydrogen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, whatever you do, bend metal, pump water, whatever. Those skills are needed across the board in the energy industry, and I think if we could really convince people the truth, and that is that there's not a bullseye on them if they're out pumping oil mm-hmm. somewhere. That's the truth. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. But what you really brought to my mind is, in that book, The Crazies, that one of the ranchers that wanted to have the wind farm so bad because he was, the money was going to make a big difference. He says, I think I'm a rancher because I don't have the imagination to do anything else. Well, I thought, it takes a lot of imagination to be a rancher, but it's interesting that he said that. His family's always done it and so forth. And what you're talking about requires imagination. It requires people talking to each other. I get my ideas listening to you, other people. And I mentioned that I thought that we're going to move into a big shift, another shift here in Montana. It won't be, even with Trump as president, that's given, he brought the oil industry in and said, give me $1 billion, what do you want? It's totally transactional. Even people working in the oil fields know that's not good, and if they value our government and our democracy. But the thing that I'm thinking is there's going to be a big change now. Even if Northwest Energy comes in, gets everything it wants from the legislature, gets everything it wants from the Public Service Commission, it's really sloppy. From what I can see, what they're planning to do with 592 megawatts of Colstrip 3 and 4 that they'll own free. Nobody else wants it. I wonder why. They get the whole thing except for what Talon and 2 other companies have. If they do what I think they're thinking of doing, it's going to be a big mistake. When I was smoke jumping, I used to say, if a jump looks too easy, be careful because there's going to be trouble. And I think this one is going to be trouble for Northwest Energy. And the reason that I think so is because if you just take 592 megawatts, not the twin 740 megawatt plants, 1,480 megawatts, which they'll all keep going. And you multiply that times their 30% efficiency, which is like the worst efficiency of anybody in the coal fleet, American coal fleet. That's just a huge amount of tonnage of carbon. And when I first got into this, I've been around Colstrip a long time. I never knew carbon was a problem. It's like the price elasticity. We didn't know. Mm-hmm. Well, now we know. We really know. And to say we didn't know, that isn't going to work. And then and there's a chapter in that book, The Crazies, that about the Public Service Commission. I hadn't been around the commission for 30 years. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, yeah, this is the way it works. And then I'm going, they did what? Those dirty buggers? I'm going, I can't believe they did it the way they did it to discourage decentralized generation. But the record is there by both the legislature and the Public Service Commission that says Northwest Energy's got a free pass here, guys. And so much so that if Northwest Energy is trying to clothe itself in the sovereign immunity of the state of Montana, won't work. I believe this will be the big lawsuit that'll just clobber Montana, because it's so obvious. It's like throwing your beer cans in a Safeway bag out the window. Because we know now, we all know now. Even the people that say climate change isn't a problem, they don't believe that. They probably go, it's a problem. Mm-hmm. So the people that are going to be injured, property-wise or personnel-wise, that have a cause, they're going to sue the shorts off with Northwest Energy and Montana Power and all the people that are taking the power. They could have a merchant plant right now for the AI and cryptocurrencies. They say crypto farms that are moving into Butte. Why not? Because they want to clothe themselves in our sovereign immunity. Well, guess what? We don't have sovereign immunity for that, unless there's a 2/3 vote by the legislature. So I think that collision, not necessarily by the same people that got the court decision for the held case, which was great, but that it's just too obvious. And so what I'm suggesting is not that anybody's a bad guy, but people better stop and take a look at where we're at. Mm-hmm. And if imagination gets put into it, the part that I would suggest is the only way we could justify approving that proposal that's starting to kind of rise in the Public Service Commission right now for the 592 megawatts of Colstrip, which they get for free, is to use part of that power to start doing away with carbon in some other fashion. Use the electricity to make hydrogen. That would be a great hydrogen infrastructure campus out there at Colstrip. There'd be a lot of jobs for the people, the metal benders and whoever, and start making hydrogen out there. I think for Burlington Northern, I did some real rough calculate using artificial intelligence, which I never knew existed a year ago, but you can run all these calculations out. But all the power that's the carbon that's emitted over a year by those two plants, if it was attached to electricity, it's enough electricity to basically generate hydrogen for about 53% of Burlington Northern's diesel. Burlington Northern is one of the biggest diesel users in the country. So if we could use stuff that's spitting out carbon mm-hmm. to reduce carbon here, and 15 years left on these plants. They're old plants, but they'll probably try to fix them up. Like my cars. All my cars were that way. You probably had a few yourself. Yeah. But they only go for so far. And then whatever comes in behind them, small modular nuclear reactors, something like that. But the more I think about it, the more I think that's going to be the problem. Mm-hmm. It's just real obvious to me. And actually, the likelihood of the business heads doing what I'm suggesting is so unlikely, because they don't like environmentalists or whatever. They got boards of directors they got to deal with. It's so unlikely they're probably going to do what they're planning to do and get clobbered, which means to me that 15 years out, the plant that will replace them will probably be a publicly held utility. because Warren Buffett, the utilities, the investor-owned utilities are taking hits in Oregon and California, and like this Southern California Edison's probably going to get hit by this Palisades fire. He said last year, he said, if we keep getting these lawsuits against us from these wildfires, we're all going to be bankrupt. It's all going to be public. And on top of that, we got the wildfire threat for the transmission line. So I hope that the business people are the ones that display the imagination, the combination of them. They certainly have the capability if they're inclined. But if they want to go high diddle diddle right up the middle, sorry folks, it's going to be bad, I think. That's my 2 cents based on my experience. Anyhow, I think we've probably talked a lot. I have, for sure.
Well,
Really like what you had to say.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Well, now we can talk more at coffee at the Merc.
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.